Hello, and welcome to the Feeling Good podcast, where you can learn powerful techniques to change the way you feel. I am your host, Dr. Rhonda Borowski, and joining me here in the Murrieta studio is Dr. David Burns. Dr. Burns is a pioneer in the development of cognitive behavioral therapy and the creator of the new TEAM therapy. He is the author of Feeling Good, which has sold over 5 million copies in the United States and has been translated into over 30 languages. His latest book, Feeling Great, contains powerful new techniques that make rapid recovery possible for many people struggling with depression and anxiety. Dr. Burns is currently an emeritus adjunct professor of clinical psychiatry at Stanford University School of Medicine.
Hello, Rhonda.
Oh, your opera training is coming through.
Yeah, since people busted me and said stop doing the weird rondas, and then other people made their voices heard and said, no, keep it up. So now I'm feeling uninhibited.
Oh, good. I like the uninhibited, David. Welcome, all of our listeners. This is the Feeling Good podcast, episode 477. David, on to you.
I can't think of anything to say.
Well, it's
one important thing to say. Happy Thanksgiving, everybody.
Happy Thanksgiving.
What's happening this week, and I love Thanksgiving. It's by far my favorite holiday, and always has been, because it's not about commercialism or presents or, Santa Claus songs or anything like that. It's just about loving people and being together with the people you love and enjoying a beautiful meal together. One of my favorite memories was when I was in college. I had this really nice roommate, Phil Allen, and he was probably the smartest guy in our class. He ended up being a solid-state physicist at Stony Brook. But he invited me to his house because I was from Phoenix, and he was from the East Coast, and he'd been to one of those fancy private schools, and I was just from a high school in Phoenix. But he was really nice, and I went to his house for Thanksgiving, and I had been studying so hard. I remember once I had convulsions, seizures, and had to be evaluated because I've been studying so much into the night, because it was really hard for me to go to Amherst and competing with these really high powered people. But he invited me to his house for Thanksgiving, and it was like being in heaven. And they gave me this beautiful bed to sleep in, and I slept for 13 hours.
Wow.
And it was just such a loving family and such a loving experience. I'll just never forget it. So I hope you all have some loved ones and some wonderful food to share on the upcoming Thanksgiving. But we're going to have part 2 of the video on anxiety disorders. And we're going to be focusing on a lot of really innovative exposure techniques, and we'll be dealing with the fear that people have of exposure and the reverse hypnosis, where patients hypnotize the doctor into being afraid to use exposure. And we'll talk about the fact that you cannot effectively treat anxiety without exposure. Exposure is not a treatment for anxiety. That's a lot of horseshit. It's just a technique and a treatment plan. But it has to be included in the treatment plan. And Jill Levitt, Dr. Jill Levitt, who's one of the country or the world's top experts in exposure therapy, is going to teach you all the tricks of the trade, teach you about so-called safety behaviors and all kinds of cool things. And I'll be telling stories as usual, including a very moving story of a veteran who hadn't been able to feel his feelings for 25 years since returning from Vietnam. And he brings up his war trauma story, and in the context of an exposure technique called memory rescripting. and the story will just bring the tears to your eyes. It's just such a beautiful story of redemption and the transformation of the human spirit, again, in a flash during an intensive I was doing down in Southern California. And so I think you'll love the workshop. And anytime I'm teaching with Jill, it's just bound to be an incredible teaching opportunity, because Jill is not only a brilliant teacher, but also a kind and compassionate person, but brilliant and fantastic teacher. So you will get your money's worth out of this. And if you don't like it, I promise you a full refund of the cost of admission. That's easy to say, since it was a free webinar. But we're doing more of these free things, and let us know if you like them, because we had over 2,000 at attendance, and we're trying to spread the word too. So maybe we get to 3,000 or 4,000 or something like that, which would be really jaw-dropping. But we appreciate your support and hope you love the webinar today.
Tips for successful exposure. Well, longer sessions can be helpful, because if we want to do an exposure with a patient and make sure that they stay in the situation until their anxiety comes down, then having more time to do that can be really helpful.
I often schedule double sessions when I'm doing exposure. That's what I did with Terry. She was one of the first people I scheduled a double session for, and it worked like a charm.
And more frequent sessions can be helpful, particularly if you have patients who's kind of have a lot of anticipatory anxiety. They're worried about doing exposure. The more we do it, then the more we can kind of like get the hard work out of the way, the better off they're going to be. So treating them for longer sessions and more frequent sessions just during this kind of exposure phase can be helpful. Having them do daily homework. So basically repetition can be really helpful for patients. And I do always ask patients to practice what they're doing in session, out of session, not limiting your treatment to the office setting if you can. And I know a lot of people are doing video therapy with patients that maybe don't even live close to them. And so you have to do the best that you can. But if you have the ability to meet your patient outside of the office session and do exposure with them, that can be extremely helpful. As we've already talked about, persisting when inevitably in the moment the patient will want to back out. And really that's just encouraging them. It's showing them you believe that they can do this hard thing and get better. And sometimes modeling the behavior for the patient. So in the case of David and Terry, if that were my patient, I might have even done jumping jacks with the patient. If a patient is afraid of spiders, we might hold spiders together. So there's something that can be helpful about therapists being willing to face, the fear along with the patient. I did see some questions coming in about safety behaviors, and maybe we can answer those at the end of the presentation, since I know we have a lot of other things that we want to cover. So I talked about kind of the fear and avoidance hierarchy and moving through things kind of methodically and slowly. And then David's going to share with you a story about someone we worked with together in the Tuesday group, where we did flooding rather than kind of gradual exposure.
Yeah, this was a beautiful woman, a wonderful woman in our Tuesday training group, and she used to bug me that she wanted me to treat her contamination phobia, her OCD. So one Tuesday we decided to do it in the group. And I'm going to skip the empathy part, but it was critically important. I'm going to skip the assessment of resistance, getting her over her outcome resistance and her process resistance. But her story was she had the same thing that Howard Hughes had, like intense fear of germs and elaborate rituals in the shower, washing her hands and cleaning herself for, an hour or 2 hours. She was especially afraid of touching doorknobs, and whenever she went into a building, she would have a tissue paper that she would use to open the door and this type of thing. And she'd been struggling with it for a good 20 to 25 years. And she knew, that I was going to, be making some strong demands on her in the methods section. And so once we came to the methods, I said, okay, now we're going to, confront the monster you fear the most. So we left the seminar room. There were about, 25 or 30 students there in the seminar. And we went into the women's bathroom in the behavioral sciences building. And fortunately, there was no one else in there, and so all 30 people went crowding in there, and we, went over to one of the toilets. I said, I want you to touch this toilet seat with your hands. And she said, oh, no, I couldn't possibly do that. And I said, oh, you can. You just move your hands and you start touching the toilet seat and rub your hands all over the toilet seat. And she said, I'd like to see you do it. So I said, okay. So I started rubbing my hands all over the toilet seat. And then she saw that nothing happened to me. So she did the same thing. And then she picked up the toilet seat and rubbed her hands around the inside of the toilet, which I thought was very brave. And I asked her how anxious she was, because she had estimated it initially at 100 on a 0 to 100. And she said it had gone up to 120. And I said, okay, we're moving in the right direction. And one of the ideas is you don't try to help the patient relax or feel better during exposure. So you do the opposite. Say, you got it up to 120 out of 100 is good, but now let's see if we can get it up to 150. Let's walk out to the front of the building, and there'll be a lot of door handles along the way. And I'm going to have you touch every door handle without tissue paper. And so this was really, really freaking her out. But she was a good egg, and she was doing it, and all these 30 students were traipsing after us, and it was kind of fun for them to see something live and happening in real time. And then we got out in front of the building, and there was an empty garbage can there, right outside, next to the entrance to the behavioral sciences building. And I said, now I want you to put your hands in here and rub your hands around in that, grimy black stuff. And it was really disgusting. And she said, oh, no, I couldn't possibly do that. And I said, oh, yes, you possibly could do that. And you are going to do that. Again, I'm pushing her. I'm insisting that she does this. And that's one of the important keys, to do that with compassion. Again, I had gotten a perfect score from her on my empathy. So she really admired me and trusted me. So she said, no, if I put my hands in there, I'm going to vomit. And I said, that would be even better. Just put your hands in there and then vomit all over everything and rub your hands around in all that grime, because it was like a millimeter of black grime all inside that garbage container. And she said, well, I'd like to see you do it. So I put my hands in and rubbed them around, and they got all black. And then I rubbed it all over my face. And then I said, okay, Sarah, now I want you to do that. And I'll show you what happened in the next screen. This one of my students had an iPhone there, and there's Sarah next to the garbage can, and you see her sticking her hands in right now. This is an ultra short video.
Right, it's a super, super short video, so you get to hear the story, and you just get to watch the last few seconds here. So I will press play right now. Oops, hold on.
Oh, beautiful.
And then we went all back into the seminar room and sat down, and I saw that she was crying. And I said, Sarah, what are you crying about? And she said, Dr. Burns, I'm cured of my OCD. And I'm just unbelievably grateful. I'm not afraid of germs or contamination anymore. And that was just an awesome experience. Then again, by way of follow-up, because some people say, oh, well, anyone can do that, but does it last? And she's now been free of, OCD and germ phobia for, it was at least 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago. And she unfortunately has a flu, or she would have joined us today to be happy to talk to you or answer any questions that you had. But she's just a delightful person. But again, it was the curative thing. And just like Terry, it took courage on my part. It took courage on her part. She kept trying to tell me this is too dangerous, but you have to push ahead. But you get pushy in a kindly and loving way, and that's part of the art of therapy, is to know, how to balance those two forces.
And I was going to say, David, some people have questions, and we will not be addressing these kinds of questions about like isn't that dangerous, or like isn't driving inherently dangerous? Aren't germs inherently dangerous? What I will say, if you want to make a quick comment, David, you can. But what I will say is, of course, life is inherently dangerous. And so, we're not ever promising our patients that they're protected from danger. This is part of what we call agenda setting or assessment of resistance. We're making the decision with the patient that it's worth it to them to tolerate some level of risk to gain freedom in their life, right? We're doing cost benefit analysis. We're looking at how much it's costing them to do the things that they're doing. And we're making that choice ahead of time. So we're not taking patients and saying, you must do this to get better. We're having a whole conversation with them about what change looks like, what they really want. Is it worth it to them to do the work it's going to take to get there? And we decide all of that ahead of time. But then when we're in the moment and we're actually doing exposure that we've decided upon with the patient and resistance shows up, that's when we are, confidently forging ahead, because we know we've made the decision that this is the right thing to do, and that the only way the patient is going to get over it in this moment is by going through it.
Yeah, but I think those questions just show how all you folks are being hypnotized by our patients too, thinking, "Oh my goodness, it's dangerous to touch a garbage can."
Right.
I know a lot of therapists used to say, "Wasn't it dangerous? You asked Terry to stand up when she said, if I stand up, I'm going to pass out, and you asked her to stand up. Wasn't that terribly dangerous?" Well, let me ask you folks, is it dangerous to stand up from a chair? Have any of you ever sat in a chair and then stood up? And is that a terribly dangerous thing to do? You see, the patients are putting us in this hypnotic state. I'll check it out right now. I'll see if I can stand up. Yes, surprisingly, I could stand up.
And then, of course, people will have questions like, what if someone has a heart condition? Well, all of those things are very specific. Of course, we're never intentionally putting our patients in danger. And I will say, for patients who have panic attacks that come to see me, they've usually the people who've had the full cardiac workup, they've been to the ER many times, like you have evidence that they do not have a heart condition. They've already ruled that out. We know that it's anxiety. But I think we should forge ahead because we've got more to share. And we can always answer more questions at the end if we got more questions.
But thank you for all these questions. And means you're engaged and you're touching on the most important things and issues emotionally for therapists and for patients. Like, what is the price of a cure?
Yeah.
Okay, in the what if technique is a great it's a cognitive technique, but it's a cognitive exposure technique, you might say, and you want to uncover a patient's core fear using the what if technique. And then once you uncover the core fear, you have them confront that using exposure. And to give you an example of that, a man was once referred to me by a colleague in Philadelphia, said he thought this guy was the top courtroom attorney in the United States, that he had lost only one case in his entire career, but he was very unhappy. And he was a very nice fellow. I just liked him tremendously. But he had only lost one case in court during his entire career, and he was in his 60s. And that's so very unusual because every time an attorney wins, the other attorney loses. And so for him to have a record like that was pretty unbelievable. And he took on giant corporations in environmental contamination cases, and he brought them to his knees. He worked, solo on these incredibly difficult cases, and nearly always won. But he told me that he'd been unhappy since he was a little boy, and he hadn't had 1 minute of happiness in his whole life. And when he came to me, he had just completed 30 years of 5-day-a-week psychoanalysis. I asked him, what did you find out? Did you find out why you've been so unhappy? And he said, well, the psychoanalyst told me it was because I had a baby brother who died when I was little, died in a fire, and I'm subconsciously blaming myself for his death. And I said, was that true? And was that helpful? He says, I have no idea if it was true. I can tell you, it never helped me. Nothing helped me. And so the thought that on his daily mood log that kept coming up was, what if I lose a case in court? And he told me that he would just work 7 days a week preparing for cases, and that he couldn't even go on vacation anymore because he just worked constantly on vacation. So I wanted to see what was his worst fear. And so I did the what if technique. And this is an easy technique to do, which you might enjoy incorporating it in your practice if you haven't already. It's one of 3 powerful uncovering techniques. And if we go to the next slide, I'll show you how it works. So he was saying, what if I lose a case in courts? I say, write that down on a daily mood log in the negative thought column and put an arrow under it. And the arrow means, this is the downward arrow. If that were true, what would it mean to you? Why would it be upsetting to you? And whatever the patient says next, you say, good, write that down. And then you keep doing it until you get to the core belief. And so he said, well, then people will lose confidence in me. And then he wrote it down, and I wrote it down, and I said, let's suppose that happened. What would happen next? If people lose confidence in you, what are you the most afraid of? And then people will stop referring clients to me. And then what's the worst that could happen if they stop referring clients to you? What are you the most afraid of? Well, then I'll go bankrupt. And which was kind of absurd because the guy was pretty darn wealthy because he was such a successful attorney. And then but if you went bankrupt, then what then? What are you afraid of? Then my wife will leave me, and my daughters will stop loving me. And then what's the worst that could possibly happen? And he said, then I'll end up homeless and alone. And his core fantasy was being a homeless man on the, on the streets of Philadelphia and begging with a tin cup. And then attorneys he beat in court walk past and kick sand at him and say, oh, there's the great Jeffrey. He used to think he was so fantastic. And look at him now. He's pathetic. And although he rationally knew this wasn't going to happen, emotionally he believed this would happen, that he was in danger. And so this downward arrow not only showed me his core belief, but his self-defeating beliefs, which was perfectionism. He believes I must be perfect, but especially perceived perfectionism. People won't accept, respect, or love me if I fail. And I was trying to find, how can I get him to crush these core beliefs? And the answer is, find a way for the patient to confront his worst fear using some form of exposure. And so when he was working with me, he coincidentally lost his second case in court. And it was just a trivial case he took on pro bono as a favor to a friend. And the reason he lost is the man he was defending was as guilty as sin and, deserved to lose the case. But he was terrified that people would find out. And he was thinking, how am I going to hide this so people don't find out? And so then the experiment came to me, and he was the chairman or the law board or whatever it's called. He was the head of it in Pennsylvania, and they were having a meeting that week. And I said, at the meeting, tell 10 of your colleagues that you just lost a case in court, and then find out how they respond to you. And you can keep a 3x5 card in your suit pocket. He used to wear these very expensive suits and bow at the beginning of sessions, very formal, like some powerful attorney. And then if they respond negatively, you put it in the negative column. If they respond positively, you put it in the positive column. And if you're not sure, you put it in the third column. And he resisted this intensely, that he didn't want them to find out he'd lost a case in court. But again, I had to say, you must do this if you wish to continue working with me. This is not a negotiation. This is a demand. And he was a good egg. He'd suffered his entire life. He said he had never had 1 minute of happiness, and he'd do anything to if he could overcome this. Oh, I see. Okay, yes, we'll come back then to it. And the next week he came in, and he said that he was stunned by what happened, and he pulled out his 3x5 card and he told 10 attorneys, "I just lost a case in court," and he said 5 of the 10 appeared not to have heard what I said, and they just kept talking about how great they were and all of the cases they'd won, and, kind of bragging the way he said attorneys tend to do. And I realized I'd been involved in the distortion of magnification and minimization, magnifying my importance in the eyes of other people and minimizing the extreme narcissism of American attorneys. So he said that was a relief to, that reaction that they had. But he said the other 5 was even more powerful. He said not only were they not critical of me, they opened up right away, and they said, "Oh, Jeffrey, God bless you for telling me this. It's a relief to know that someone as great as you, one of maybe the greatest attorneys in American history, can lose a case in court. And I feel so much closer to you now. And let me tell you about all the cases I've been losing in court. And let me tell you about my wife who's about to divorce me. And let me tell you about my children who were using drugs and hanging out with the wrong crowd, and I don't know how to talk to them." And he said, Dr. Burns, and tears came to his eyes. He said it was the weirdest thing in the world. I felt joy for the first time in my life. I felt that I had something to give people, and my anxiety, my fear disappeared finally after 60 years. And it was such a heartwarming thing because, and his whole persona changed, and he stopped acting so formal. And because I actually didn't like him because he was so formal, and I was afraid, and, he was so formal. I thought maybe he's getting ready to sue me or something like that. And then when he showed his vulnerability and reported that back, he became like a regular fellow, like a friend. And I felt so close to him and felt so much warmth and admiration and gratitude. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about our work is we're not just treating symptoms, but we're trying to save the life of a human being and cause a meaningful transformation in someone, to try to bring someone actually like Jeffrey to a state of enlightenment. And sometimes recovery has a kind of a philosophical or almost spiritual dimension, and it was certainly the case for Jeffrey.
It's also a beautiful example of how therapy is such an art form, that we can teach you all the different components and different strategies and methods. And it's also somehow, there are just times where you decided to do the what if technique to uncover what that core fear was, and probably didn't know ahead of time what you'd end up finding. And once you found it, you had to be sort of creative, like how can we actually figure out if this is true or not, right? You did some interpersonal exposure with him. Again, that kind of the self-disclosure and a survey technique, and sort of each method built on the other to end up with such a kind of beautiful outcome.
Yeah.
And so, we are going to talk to you a little bit about kind of 2 forms of cognitive exposure that can be really helpful when you're working with patients. And one of them is cognitive flooding, and I'll talk to you guys a bit about cognitive flooding. And the other one is memory rescripting. And David will share with you a story where he used memory rescripting. And some of you have asked in the chat, what do we do when we have things that patients are afraid of that they can't really confront in reality? Someone texted, that they have a patient who's really afraid of getting a terrible illness. And So these are the examples where cognitive exposure can be incredibly effective. So cognitive flooding in particular is where we'd have the patient actually close their eyes and imagine kind of the worst thing, the thing they're most afraid of happening. And in fact, the what if technique that David just shared with you can be really useful in getting to that core fear. What is it the patient is most afraid of? And then once you get there, you can have the patient close their eyes and imagine that terrible thing happening. So if it were that they were afraid they'd get sick and even be suffering and eventually die of a particular illness, they could actually imagine that. We'll do it with the patient in session, and we'll actually ask the patient throughout the cognitive exposure, the telling, what their anxiety rating is from 0 to 100 every minute or two. That's really so we can understand what are the hardest parts of the exposure for them. And also so we know if they're not really doing it, meaning if they're not very anxious, we want to try to encourage them to think about it in a way that's going to bring on more anxiety. Can you get yourself to be more anxious or worried about it? So you can tell if the patient's avoiding because you're asking them for their anxiety rating. We're encouraging them to constantly try to intensify the anxiety, and we're going to have them continue doing it until the anxiety goes away. We also record the exposure with them in session. So nowadays that's pretty easy because most patients have a recording device on their phone. And then we can actually assign it to them to listen to that recording over and over again for homework. And I'm going to walk you through an example of this. I actually do like to have my patients write out a script. So some people will just have them close their eyes and imagine it on the spot. I just think sometimes it can be helpful to have people write out the script. And so they're asking themselves, and what happens next? And what am I most afraid of? And they can kind of write it out. Then they can actually read the script in session. And also just to address some therapist questions, sometimes an exposure might be 10 minutes long. And I usually try to get my patients or assign my patients to do their exposure for 30 minutes a day, every day. So if it's a short script, I say then you just keep listening to it over and over again until the 30 minutes are up. If it's a 15-minute script, you can listen to it twice. But the goal is to really get them to kind of lean in and bring on all of what they're afraid of. And I'll give you an example. There was a patient that I was working with many years ago who actually had contamination OCD. So she was worried and about contracting an illness, and she was worried that it was going to get her sick and get her children sick. And she had very kind of classic contamination OCD. But what kept coming up in sessions was she was also so worried about the idea that her OCD was going to lead her to lose her mind. And so while we were doing different exercises using hierarchies and things like that and exposure and response prevention to work on her OCD, what kept getting in the way of therapy actually was her ruminating and obsessing about the fact that this OCD would never go away and that she would ultimately lose her mind. And so I thought, maybe we need to address this kind of category of anxiety before continuing on with this contamination exposure. And so I did the what if technique with her to understand what is it that she was most afraid of. You might be thinking, well, losing her mind is bad enough, isn't it? Like, isn't that what she could imagine? But I was curious and I asked her, let's imagine that you did lose your mind. What would that look like? And then what are you most afraid of? And it turned out that she was actually most afraid. She had 2 young children. She was most afraid that she would end up being hospitalized and institutionalized and that her children would grow up without a mother. And when she got to that sort of admission, she was sobbing. And that was truly the thing that she felt most afraid of, that she would abandon her children and that they would be left kind of not alone, but without a mother for the rest of their lives. And so we decided to address that using cognitive exposure. So I had her write this script and then record it with me. And I will tell you that doing cognitive exposure with patients can be extremely painful. You'll have patients who are imagining the most terrible things happening to them and sobbing in your office. And that's what happened with her. And again, just like David, I had to be confident and kind of pushy and saying, I know this feels awful now, but this is what we need to do to kind of get you to the other side. So I had her recorded and her anxiety was up at 100 and she was crying and skeptical that this would actually be effective. But we did it in session, and then I assigned it to her for homework and asked her to listen to that recording, 30 minutes a day, every day. And I said, it doesn't matter how long it takes. We're just going to keep doing it until this recording no longer bothers you, which sounded incomprehensible to her. But a week later, she came back having listened to her recording every day. She was happy to report that honestly, it bored her. She just didn't really think about it very much anymore. She kind of got used to listening to herself, and the story seemed ridiculous and unlikely, and it just didn't bother her anymore. And we needed to then kind of shift gears and get back to working on her contamination OCD, but she no longer brought up this fear that she was going to lose her mind and end up abandoning her children. So it was incredibly effective, but also I relate to that therapist experience of worrying in the moment. Am I actually making my patient feel worse, right? But it's this idea that more anxiety in the short term is going to bring relief in the long term. And David, did you want to share your story about memory rescripting? We do have time for you to do that, and then we can shift gears and do some questions and some follow-up information.
Well, I'll see if I can give a kind of quick story of it. But essentially with memory rescripting, you have the patient close their eyes and go into the past and relive some horrible traumatic experience. But you can also have them change the script, have it come out a little bit differently. So that they're in control, and it's just a concept, and you can do it in 100 different ways. But I was doing an intensive for a small group of maybe 35 therapists in Southern California a number of years ago, and that's a 4-day training experience, and we work from morning till late at night and have dinners together, and it's very, very intense. And people's defenses break down and they open up, and we start feeling close to each other, by the second and definitely third day of the intensive, while learning techniques. But there was one fellow that didn't fit in very, very well. He said that he was a pastoral counselor from New Mexico, but he was very formal and like kind of always trying to impress people. And I remember my father was a minister, and when he prayed, he used to pray with a warbling voice, like, "Dear Lord, please bless us, thy people," like that. And I shouldn't probably be critical because he had a congregation who really loved him. But I used to think, Dad, why do you have such a stupid, warbly voice when you pray? Does it go through the clouds better and get up to God if you're warbling? And why do you speak in medieval English? Doesn't God understand modern English? And it was irritating. And this guy was like that, talking this warbly voice all the time. And he wasn't, connecting with people. And I was doing a segment on, what we're doing now, like cognitive flooding, and I was talking about how a picture in your mind, and you focus on it, it'll often bring powerful emotions. The pictures are almost like sentences that upset you, upsetting pictures. And I was about to go on to the next technique, and this fellow, this pastoral counselor, raised his hand and said, "Could I ask you a question?" I said, "Yeah, sure, no problem." And he said, "Are you saying that a picture in your mind can create a lot of powerful emotions?" I said, "Yes, Pastor, that's right." And he says, "Well, I have a picture in my mind right now." And I could see he was getting real shaky, like he was about to start sobbing or something like that. And I said, "What's the picture of?" He says, my nephew Jimmy. And he said, you see, I said, "Tell me about your nephew Jimmy." And I said, "Well, you see, I've been telling you I'm a pastoral counselor from New Mexico, but that's not my true identity. I'm actually someone different from that." And I said, I got shocked. I said, "Well, what are you doing at the workshop, and who are you in reality?" He says, "Well, my name is Johnson, and I am working as a pastoral counselor, but I'm actually a pilot." I said, "Oh, what airline do you fly with?" And he says, "No, I haven't flown a plane for, 25 years or 30 years or something like that." And I said, "Well, tell us about that." And he said, "Well, I was a pilot in Vietnam, and I became the head of the thing. And so I was supervising the bombing missions over North Vietnam and Cambodia. And he said, my nephew Jimmy was one of my pilots, and that's my wife's only child, or my sister's only child, my nephew, and she wrote to me a letter that said, "We pray to God every night. Please don't let anything happen to our Jimmy." And he said that night Jimmy came back in a body bag. And I went down to, identify the body, make sure it was Jimmy, and they opened up the body bag, and I looked in, and his face had been blown off. But I knew that it was Jimmy, and I thought I would start sobbing, and something happened in my brain, and my emotions got turned off. And I have had no emotions for 30 years. I can't feel anything, Dr. Burns. That's partially why I came to this conference, because I'm a human being, but I don't have emotions. And I don't know why. I can't feel anything. And he was just shaking, and I said, "You look to me like you're on the verge of tears right now. Maybe you need to go ahead and let those feelings out right now." And then he just started sobbing uncontrollably and just shaking, and snot was going down, out of his nose, and tears were flowing down his cheeks, and he put his head in his hands, and he was just shaking, and half the workshop started sobbing. And then he pulled himself back together, and a woman sitting opposite him said, "Pastor Johnson, I want you to know that during the Vietnam War, I was one of the protesters here in Los Angeles, and we hated people like you, and we protested against people like you. But I can see that you gave your best for the country. And I just wanted to say thank you." And then she started sobbing, and he started sobbing again. And then afterwards, he said, "You've all heard about the Medal of Honor. The U.S. gives out the Medal of Honor. Well, so did the Vietnam government, and I received the Medal of Honor for the things I did, in Vietnam from the Vietnamese government." And when we came back to America and we got off the plane, there was no one there in the airport waiting for us. My sister wasn't there, our friends weren't there, our family weren't there, none of us, nobody was there to greet us. And when we walked through the airport, people started spitting on us. And Jan, the thank you you just gave me is the first one I've received in the last 35 years, the only thank you I've ever gotten. And then everyone just burst out sobbing at that point. And that was it. But we didn't need to do the rescripting. All he needed to do was to visualize the face of his nephew. And that brought all the emotions out. And that night when we went out for dinner, we got pizza someplace as a group. And he sat next to me, and all that warbly voice thing had disappeared. And he was just so cool and awesome and funny and friendly and down to earth. But that's how you can bring people into the past and then work with the memories and images in just a huge variety of ways. But that is just to give you a feel for the power of pictures as well as thoughts. Pictures are cognitions just as thoughts are cognitions, and they can contain potential emotion. And as a therapist, you don't want to be afraid of emotion, but go with the patient to the gates of hell, because that's often where the miracles occur.
Absolutely. Such a beautiful story, David. And you're such a talented storyteller, too. I think we could all sit and listen to you for hours. So I think what we will kind of cover just some brief take-home messages, and then we'll share with you some follow-up training opportunities, and then we'll go to the Q&A until the end of the hour. I'm happy to talk about this, David, unless you want to.
No, you go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think we've highlighted these points throughout. So maybe this is all pretty clear to you guys, but clearly we're asking our patients to do really hard things. And so trust and rapport are super important, as is hope and confidence on the part of the therapist, instilling hope in our patients that they actually can get a cure, that they can get relief and get over this thing they've been afraid of for so long, and our confidence and belief that we have the tools to be able to help them. And I would say, if you're a therapist who's like, but I don't have that confidence, well, then get more training, right? Seek out training, consultation. Just occurred to me, I didn't even put a slide about this, but I run an exposure consultation group where we just talk about how to implement exposure. We have lots of other consultation groups and trainings on the topics in general, but, get support, get consultation, get supervision. Don't forget that it's super important to initially address outcome and process resistance, and come to another training where we teach you how to do that, but recognize that we're not just jumping in and doing exposure with our patients. Exposure is one of many ways of treating anxiety. And in any case, you definitely need to be addressing resistance and motivation. Remember that you can use gradual exposure or you can use flooding. Make sure that you pay attention to safety behaviors, because they can really sabotage exposure and overall treatment. And don't settle for partial recovery. Know that your patient can get over their fears and that you can help them to do that. And again, that exposure is a really powerful method that you can have in your toolbox to help that along the way. So I'll do a little bit of sort of like, if you'd like to learn more, and then we'll take your questions, and Mike has been collecting them throughout. So if today's training sparked something in you, and if you feel excited about what you learned and you'd like to take your skills deeper, we'd love to invite you to join our Fast Track to Level 3 certification course. It's our kind of most efficient and powerful way to help therapists that are interested in learning and growing and kind of mastering these strategies. What we covered today was literally one of 50 plus methods that we teach in the Fast Track course to help therapists become better therapists and to help patients to recover faster. I'll just share this kind of one testimonial that Sarah Chickering shared with us, which was that this course was one of the best decisions that she'd made for herself professionally, because it really grew her confidence and her toolbox. And this slide is kind of packed, but just to give you the full picture of what's involved, our Fast Track course begins on September 11th, and it's a hybrid format. It's designed for busy professionals. So you get to watch videos of me and David teaching. I'm doing a lot of the didactic teaching, and David and I have a lot of interviews and, again, cool stories to share with you, and you kind of consume all of that asynchronously at your own pace. And then we meet weekly where you can actually practice the tools that you're learning. And so you have a weekly practice group. We also start out with a David Burns live. So there's a 4-hour live kind of teaching session where we're actually working with a therapist who's functioning as a patient, and you get to see us kind of bring this model to life live. You also get certification, you get the therapist toolkit, and right now there's a $50 off coupon for it that you can use if you sign up, I think, today. And Mike is sharing the link with you in the chat box. And beyond the Fast Track course, there's David's app, and I'm going to let David tell you a little bit about the Feeling Great app.
Yeah, the Feeling Great app is it's free for the summer between now and probably the end of September, and it's both classes and lessons. It's for you and your patients, but there's also we've trained the AI to function pretty much the same way I function in an actual therapy session. And we've gotten beautiful endorsements from people that it's been life-changing. We've looked at the research data and the reduction in negative feelings, not only depression, but anxiety and anger and hopelessness and loneliness and inadequacy. All diminish with most patients within a couple of hours the first time they sit down with the app. So if you're an individual wanting help with depression or anxiety, here, jump on the thing right now. I don't know if we'll be around forever. But it's in existence now. The Feeling Great app, and it can be helpful. It can be an adjunct if you're in therapy with someone. But it can also help you if you don't have a therapist. It's not trying to be therapy. It's a self-help tool, much like my books, Feeling Good and Feeling Great and When Panic Attacks. But it's a new tool, and it's quite different from anything else. And it's just beautiful. The empathy that it does is mind blowing. It'll melt away resistance, and it knows many of these techniques we've been talking about in today's seminar.
Yeah, and also the Feeling Great app is great for therapists as well. And you can get the app, and your patients can get the app, and then you can actually be giving patients homework and things like that to really enhance the therapy that you're doing with your patients. And then we also just put this slide up, and now we're going to do some Q&A, but there are other ways you can learn and grow with us. We have a free weekly practice group David and I run on Tuesday evenings from 5 to 7 p.m. And if you're interested in that, you would contact Ed Walton, that email address. That's it's not a drop-in group, though. You need to make a commitment that you're going to come regularly if you'd like to be a part of it. That's only for therapists. There's also one on Wednesday mornings with Rhonda and Kai, similar kind of format for therapists.
And I want to emphasize, if some of you want to learn more about what we've taught you today and really learn the fine points, that's unlimited free training every week from David and Jill. And so if you'd like to, and it's virtual, so you can join from anywhere in the world.
Yes, and then you can also get David's podcasts and the Feeling Great on YouTube. And so those are other options for additional free training. We're going to go to Q&A now.
At the beginning, you introduced the 4 different models. Is there a way to sort of surmise which model might potentially be best for the person? What model do you use for different people?
No, I don't think like that. I use all 4 models for every anxious patient that I treat. We've only shown you in detail the exposure model and a little bit about the cognitive model, but with every single patient, I empathize, and then I melt away resistance. Outcome resistance and process resistance, and also the hidden emotion model that we haven't talked about at all today is absolute blow away, and is so helpful for many anxious patients. I go in with all guns blazing with every patient.
It seems the trend for these techniques are using exposure for the perceived fears versus a lived traumatic experience. Am I assuming this too much? And that was towards Jill, that question.
Yeah, I would say no. The answer is that's not true. So my understanding of the question is saying, are we doing cognitive exposure only for what we imagine to be the worst case scenario? And no, actually, I use cognitive exposure very often for patients who have post-traumatic stress disorder, right? So the thing that we actually use the cognitive exposure for is the trauma memories. And David gave an example of that. So that question might have come before David's example. But with post-traumatic stress disorder, it can be extremely helpful, actually, to have the person retell the trauma memory, right, from beginning to end. And some of the hardest work that I've done has been sitting with patients recounting truly, horrific childhood physical and sexual abuse, 9/11 stories. And yet that can be some of the most powerful work. So yes, this exposure can absolutely be done for lived experience as well.
Yeah, I would say in my case, trauma patients have probably been the easiest group of patients to treat. I had one that took about 10 or 11 sessions, very severe sadistic childhood sexual abuse that went on for 5 years. But almost all my other trauma patients have been single session cures, you might say. But when I say a single session, I always treat people in 2-hour sessions, and I treat people for free, so money isn't an issue as far as time. And I just work with someone until their symptoms have disappeared, and trauma patients have been just incredibly responsive to TEAM and all these techniques, including the exposure techniques, but especially the cognitive techniques.
Question, David, regarding Terry. How do you know she wasn't just pretending to feel better because of her niceness? Like when she said she wanted to do the session, but then changed her mind when she was alone.
Well, she'd have to be the greatest actress in the world to mimic uncontrollable laughter. And when she came back in 2 weeks, I didn't recognize her. Her appearance had actually changed, and I introduced myself. She was all dressed up. I don't mean to be sexist. I probably am old and sexist, but you saw that she was dressed rather drably, and sometimes the external reflects the internal. And she was, as I say, extraordinarily severely depressed. And when she came back, she was smiling and joyous, and she'd been on a kind of a crash diet, but she looked like a cover girl cover lady for Cosmopolitan magazine or something. And she said, "Don't you recognize me?" And I says, "No, I thought you were a new patient." She says, "Look at me. This is Terry." And I said, "Oh my God, you're Terry." But she wasn't just undepressed. She was jubilant, and she's been that way, as I say, for over 40 years, 30 years, 30, 40 years. Yeah.
What gave Dr. Burns the confidence to keep going over clients' protestations?
That's the way I am.
There's quite a few questions. Maybe this one's for you, Jill. Just how do you incorporate some of these techniques with telehealth, with video therapy?
Yeah, and one other thing I was just going to say when David said that's just the way I am.
Okay.
But also, I mean, David and I both, we're not afraid of emotion. And in fact, we love emotion. I think that's why we do what we do. Like, that's what makes our work real. And so I'm not worried if a patient is highly anxious that that's going to be damaging, or that if a patient is sobbing that that's going to last forever. And I think really having confidence that quite often, as David says, going to the gates of hell, experiencing intense emotions without avoidance is, such an important part of the healing process. And so I think it's that we don't have that fear that we're going to damage or hurt our patients. And I think that's what contributes a lot to that confidence. Your next question was about telehealth. I think you have to be creative. But if there's something that I can do with a patient online, if it were a dog phobia or a spider phobia, if there are things we can actually do together online. I was treating a patient who had a fear of in getting an injection, shots and stuff. And so actually what we ended up doing was finding a really fantastic video of like a phlebotomist training video, where we got to watch all sorts of videos about, needles and injections and things. And we did that during the session. So there are times you can be creative and do exposure in session with the patients. You can also recruit another person, like maybe there's a family member, and you can kind of teach them and tell them how to do the exposure with the patient. Otherwise, you have to have the patient doing it on their own. I know actually Richard Lamb, who works at Feeling Good Institute, said for social anxiety exposures, he'll have the patient have him on video on the phone. And then they'll go to the sort of let's say downtown where they need to go talk to 5 people, and he'll have them talk to 5 people, and he'll kind of be in their pocket, so to speak. So yeah, there are ways that you need to kind of be creative to try to do this stuff on video therapy. But I will definitely do cognitive exposure with patients on video therapy just as I would in person.
Maybe time for two more. One quick one. Somebody put, I feel like I've been taught everything wrong in therapy. My therapist is all about trying to regulate during moments of anxiety, stepping away, using breathing techniques to lessen the anxiety. And you're saying the opposite. Can you explain what I should do when I experience social anxiety, especially in a social context? I don't understand. Just let it happen with no calming.
You want to answer that, David?
Well, I'll let you answer because I didn't get the second part of it, but I sure resonated with the first part of it. I sometimes I'm elderly, so I'm irritable half the time now. It's horrible, so you should avoid me. But I get irritated when I hear about the kind of therapy a lot of people are doing, just the opposite of what we're teaching, and it frustrates me. But you can answer the second part. The second part.
Okay. Yeah, my answer in general is like, I want people, there's a bit of a difference between I like to meditate or exercise or something like that to manage stress or because it feels good. I don't have a problem with that. That's, there are strategies people use to feel good and healthy and calm and grounded outside the context of like an acute fear or anxiety. I think the problem is when people rely on doing A, B, or C to not feel anxious in the moment. And why is that a problem? Number one, because it's like a crutch. That means every time I feel anxious, I have to do, hold my charm or say my mantra or do my deep breathing. I'm never actually cured of my anxiety. I'm just learning how to cope with my anxiety or how to stifle my anxiety in the moment. I also think that any reliance on something like that, like I must do X to get through it, kind of still sends you the message cognitively that I am not safe. I need to do this in order to be okay, versus building the ability to experience and tolerate anxiety and to know no matter what, like I could be incredibly anxious and I know I'm okay. I don't have to do anything to try to get rid of those feelings.
I think that's all we have time for today.
Yeah. So I guess what I will say then, is to say thank you to everyone for attending today. It was always an honor to present with David, to listen to these stories, no matter how many times I hear them. I love them. You're totally an inspiration to all of us, David. And thank you to Mike for helping facilitate with us today. And thanks to all of you for spending 2 hours with us. We hope to see you in a future training, and hope that we're contributing to your growth as a therapist or as a patient along the way.
Thank you, Jill. You've taught me tremendous things. I'm so grateful for knowing you and teaching with you. And Mike, I just love both of you. You're both fantastic, and I love and appreciate all of you for coming today. And thanks to Maor for sponsoring these free events. A lot of effort goes into them, and Jill and Maor and all the people at the Feeling Good Institute make these things possible. And so I just say thank you. It's just a fantastic 2 hours for me, and I hope all of you enjoyed yourself as well, and maybe learned a little something, and maybe got challenged to think in some new directions.
Thanks, and hope to see you guys soon.
This has been another episode of the Feeling Good podcast. For more information, visit Dr. Burns' website at feelinggood.com, where you will find the show notes under the podcast page. You will also find archives of previous episodes and many resources for therapists and non-therapists. We welcome your comments and questions. If you want to support the show, please share the podcast with people who might benefit from it. You could also go to iTunes and leave a 5-star rating. I am your host, Rhonda Borowski, the director of the Feeling Great Therapy Center. We hope you enjoyed this episode. I invite you to join us next time for another episode of the Feeling Good podcast.